Daniel, and I am the social purpose leader out of Houston. And today we will be hosting a roundtable discussion in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. on Emancipation Park, the historical and design significance of the project. And joining us today, we have Ms. Jacqueline Bostic, who is a vice chairperson for Emancipation Park Conservancy, and Kenneth Luker, who is a design principal out of the North Carolina studio. And so, as you all know, with the world we live in right now with COVID, usually typically on, today, it being Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we would host a day of service where our social purpose teams would help create events in which we're able to engage with our communities in person. However, with COVID, we were trying to brainstorm of ways that we can continue to engage with one another virtually. And so hence this virtual roundtable, as well as a virtual volunteer opportunity, which was sent out in the calendar invite, and that we can give some additional information to you guys on at the end of this session. So from there, we'll go ahead and go into some introductions of our panelists. And so Ms. Jacqueline Bostic is the vice chairperson with Emancipation Park Conservancy and also the great-granddaughter of one of the park's founders, Reverend Jack Yates. And for those who don't know a little bit about Emancipation Park Conservancy, it is a nonprofit organization here in Houston tasked with restoring, managing, and enhancing Emancipation Park. The organization's purpose is to create an open space of environmental and community excellence while continuing to preserve the integrity and historical roots of the park. Its goal is to transform the park into one of the nation's premier landmarks and parks and destinations through capital initiatives, operational improvements, and strategic partnerships, programming, and events. So we're also grateful to have some people from Emancipation Park Conservancy on the line today, as well as obviously Ms. Jacqueline Bostic. But a little bit about Ms. Bostic: she's had a long career as a groundbreaker in Houston. During her 32-year career with the United States Postal Service, Ms. Bostic has achieved many firsts, paving the way for others. She was the first female education specialist in the Houston Postal District from 1967 to 1974. She was the first female and African American to serve as investigator to the Southern Region from 1974 to 1986, the first to serve as postmaster in several offices, and the first to serve as the president of the American Postal Workers, and the first African American female legislative director for Texas. Wow, that's a mouthful. She's done so many amazing things throughout her life, but also as a community volunteer. Ms. Bostic has served on the board of directors for the Houston Postal Credit Union and the Houston YWCA, and on the national board of the YWCA. She has also served as a national vice president of Jack and Jill of America Incorporated, treasurer of the Women's Auxiliary of the National Baptist Convention of America USA Incorporated, and she was the first female in the greater Houston area. I think we're getting some background. Someone please mute. Thank you. In the greater Houston area, accepted into the Rotary International. And since 1995, she's been president and chairman of the Antioch Project Reach Incorporated, which is a nonprofit that provides housing to neglected areas, and currently serves as chairman of the Fourth Ward Redevelopment Authority and TERS number 14 for the city of Houston. So, Ms. Bostic, you've done so many amazing things in your life, and we're so grateful to have you join us today and to help participate in this conversation. And then also introducing Kenneth Luker, who's a principal out of North Carolina. Kenneth's career has been defined by architecture that promotes awareness of self-empathy for others. Narratives that define people and place are the foundation of his design process. Through direct engagement with communities, he activates dialogue to create built forms where individuals can find their place within a shared story. Kenneth brings the same openness and curiosity to leading project teams, motivated by the belief that design is not a solo act. He invites diverse views and ideas into his creative and inclusive process. He enjoys gaining insight from each collaborative effort equally, as much as mentoring young designers in conceptual clarity, formal composition, and the social ideals that exemplify his practice. So again, thank you both so much for joining us today. And as you all know, we're having this roundtable in honor of Martin Luther King and the legacy that he has put forth for fighting for a more just and equitable world. And, as a little bit about Emancipation Park, also, it was founded in 1872 by Reverend Jack Yates, Richard Allen, Richard Brock, and Reverend Elias Stibble. And it is the oldest public park in Texas and a significant site during the civil rights movement here in Houston. And it's located in the 3rd Ward and was obviously newly redesigned by our North Carolina office. And it's a 10-acre park that encompasses an interwoven tapestry of buildings, landscape, and continues to serve as a very important community hub here in Houston and throughout the nation. So again, thank you all for joining us. Ms. Jacqueline, I'm going to go ahead and just ask if you could tell us a little bit more about your role with Emancipation Park Conservancy. And I think you're muted right now. And unfortunately, Ms. Jacqueline, her video is not working. However, you know, we're grateful to have you on audio. I think you need to unmute Ms. Jacqueline. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you. Thank you for joining us again.
Sure.
So yeah, if you could tell us a little bit about your role with Emancipation Park Conservancy.
Well, my role with the Emancipation Park Conservancy has been to continue to serve as a volunteer and as the vice chair for the Conservancy, and to help with the park and the Conservancy provide different types of programs and events in the community, which continue to make the park a viable part of the Houston community.
Wonderful. Awesome. Thank you so much. And then Kenneth, could you tell us a little bit about your role on the Emancipation Park project?
Certainly. As we started that project, we were I was in Phil Freeland's studio at the Freeland Group, and on the project, I wasn't the project designer, but I was a design advisor as a design principal working with Phil and the team on that project. So I would touch the project throughout, from concept through construction, and more in an advisory role.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So, you know, for those who are just joining us, the format of this kind of roundtable or panel discussion, I should say, is that I and some of the social purpose and DEI team out of Houston, Austin, Dallas, and North Carolina have prepared a few questions that are going to help facilitate this discussion. However, would love to have questions from the audience as well. So if you could please use the chat function, that would be great. And I'll go ahead and help moderate those questions as we move forward. But for now, we're going to start first kind of with the history of the park. And Ms. Jacqueline, I have a few questions for you. So first, I'd love to hear a little bit more about your great-grandfather, Reverend Jack Yates. Can you tell us what you know about him and how he came to be in Houston? And I think we're going to need you to unmute again. I think you're still muted, Ms. Jacqueline. There you go. Okay, so I do that all the time, so totally okay. But yeah, if you could please tell us a little bit about your great-grandfather, and also how he came to be in Houston.
That's fine. He came to Texas really by way of Virginia. He was born in Virginia as a slave, and he came to Texas when, after the Emancipation Proclamation, the states, that people that lived in the states that were slave owners and did not want to abide by the Emancipation Proclamation, many of them came to Texas because Texas was one of those states that was going to continue to have slaves. And so he had been released and bought his way out of slavery. But then he had a family, a wife and children, and they were on a different plantation. That plantation owner wanted to keep his slaves. So in order for him to be able to take care of his family and be with his wife and children, he went back into slavery in order to be with his family, and that's how he came to Texas.
Gotcha. Wow, that's a incredible history. So do you know what year he came to Texas? I know the park was founded in 1872.
Well, he came to Texas right at the time that emancipation came about in the East, in the rest of the country, which was in 1863.
Gotcha.
So it had to be in that time frame when slave owners who did not want to abide by the law came to Texas.
Gotcha. Wow. Well, certainly he had a long history in Texas and in Houston specifically. So I know, and for those who are joining us, the links within the calendar invite have some of the more formal history of the park. If you're interested in reading more about the actual historical um, founding of the park. But Miss Jacqueline, I did want to ask you what you think the historical significance of the park is, and specifically, I guess, what it means to you.
Well, the real historical significance of the park is that in actuality, uh, the Emancipation Park is actually and was the first park in the city of Houston and in the state of Texas, whereby there was a green park space for community. Because there was no space at the time after the people who were enslaved were freed, for them to have places to go for recreation, to have meetings, to do things together as a group. In 1872, while helping to build a community which became very self-sufficient during that time, Reverend Yates and others came together and they were able to buy the 10 acres of property to make it into a park
Hmm.
so that the people who were of their community could come together and have a place that they could have recreation and do things as a body.
Gotcha. So clearly it's a significant landmark of the Third Ward neighborhood here in Houston. So and so what does the project or what does the park mean to you specifically?
Well, the park always has meant to people of the community an example of freedom. It is also an example of what people can do together when they work together, regardless of the challenges and circumstances that they face. And so these people had no uh, what we would call today in our communities as formal education. These people had no riches. They had only themselves because when they were freed in Texas, they had to leave the plantations with what the clothes on their backs. They came into the Houston area, which was a new town of about 30 years, and were allowed at that time to settle on what we call the Buffalo Bayou, which is now a part of this where the City Hall complex is. And so from not having anything, but utilizing the small resources that they were able to get and combine, they were able not only to develop their own community, but they were also able to develop what we today call a green space. They were able to develop the possibility and the ability to bring their families and their friends together to celebrate, especially on the 19th of June, what we call Juneteenth, which is a day of freedom and an expression of freedom.
Right, and I actually was going to ask you a little bit if you could tell us a little bit more about the significance of Juneteenth, particularly at Emancipation Park.
Well, because of Emancipation Park, even before they had Emancipation Park, they celebrated as best they could with parades and doing things together at their churches, houses of worships that they developed. Juneteenth, because being free was very important to them. And the date that they received their freedom, though it was not the date that other Americans received their freedom, it was very important to them. And so that's how you got the Juneteenth holiday. And so that was the one place that they could all come together and celebrate their day, the birthday of their freedom in the United States of America.
Wonderful. And I know, I believe it was in 2017 when the park first opened, and Phil Freelon was actually there. I was actually there as an intern, and some people from our Houston studio as well. And I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, that park opening was scheduled for Juneteenth. Is that correct?
Yes, it was.
Mhm.
You all had been working on it for a few years, building it out and rebuilding the different facilities on the park ground, which you all did it was really a beautiful job that you did. It was great. It still looks great. And it people love to come to it and to walk around and to see it and go in the various areas that exist. Well, in 2017 was the reopening, because during the time that you all were building the new facilities, the park was closed to the public during
Mhm.
that whole period that you were actually building. So on June 19th, 2017 was the reopening of the park. And we probably had, during that particular day, as many as 5 or 6 thousand people that came through the park. They were there to see, to learn, to be there for a program. It was just wonderful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember being at that celebration with some of my colleagues here in Houston, and it was really, personally, one of the first times that I've been able to do a community celebration here in Houston, because I had just moved here, and it was really incredible, and you could feel the magic and the history of the place during that celebration. It was phenomenal. So I guess one thing though is that the park obviously had fallen in great disrepair over the years, and that's why Perkins&Will came on to do the redevelopment of the park and the restoration. Can you tell us a little bit about how the design changes made in the park have maybe brought back some of the vibrancy of the place, and kind of the changes that you saw the park go through over the years, as you were growing up here in Houston?
Well, there were many changes, and what kind of happened through the years, once the park became a part of the city of Houston, and things moved along, and the swimming pool and everything was brought in and was built. But then somehow after the civil rights area, when once all the parks were open to citizens of color, especially African American citizens, then people had more choices and places to go. And so the interest in keeping the park up through the city and providing all the programs that it had provided through the years kind of waned as people were everybody was probably going to other parks and places, and other parks were being highlighted. Uh, so with that happening, the uh, the park kind of got in disrepair. So long about in 1995, there was a renewed interest in the community by community volunteers that somehow we had to make sure that the park did not just simply evaporate and go away, that it was a part of the history of Houston and of the state of Texas and of the nation, and that we needed to make sure that the park remained in good repair and that it had programs that the community could take part in, as it had in previous years. So once the volunteer group became very active, and I was also a part of that group, we became very active and worked with the city to try to get things turned around. Then one of the tours in the city, which is located in the area near the park, wanted to take on the project of helping the park, the city and the park, to be perhaps redesigned and kind of reprogrammed as to all the things that it could do and how it could do them very successfully. And your design team came on board and they redesigned the area as they thought as best how it would look. And there was certainly community. There were different type of charrettes and community people coming together to say what they thought they wanted there, how they wanted it to look. So it was really a collaborative effort of everybody involved to try to make the park again a place where the community could be proud of and that the community would come and participate in the different activities.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a great segue kind of into our next section of this conversation. Um, so Kenneth, I'm gonna get you to talk a little bit now. If you
Okay.
can tell us a little bit about, I think we'll talk a little bit about, why community engagement in general is important to the design process. And I think a lot of what Ms. Jacqueline was saying is exactly why that type of engagement is important. But first, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the driving concepts behind the project. Specifically, some of the, pulling on some of the historical significance of the project and some of those concepts.
Okay. And I first just want to say that I love hearing your stories, Ms. Bostic, and the fact that Jack Yates returned to enslavement in order to preserve his family, I think is an amazing story of commitment and heroism. And I think that is a bit that I had not heard before, and I'm really glad that you shared that with us. Thank you. Um, our approach to the design of the project was really to recognize, honor, and celebrate the the history of emancipation and its arrival in Texas. It arrived over 2 years late, or after President Lincoln had signed the proclamation. It took just over 2 years to arrive in Galveston, and so that long history of was part of the celebration. But then the these four individuals who founded the park, and to use their history and that story as a framework to begin to tell stories and to allow the park and the landscape there to tell stories that were very relevant to the community today. And so that was our approach to developing a design concept, was really to start with that history, to recognize, to honor it, and to celebrate that history.
Awesome. So, kind of I guess, in celebrating the history uh, of the founders and of the significance of the park, um, it was clear though that the age, with time, the park had been gratefully degraded, and it was something that was a large undertaking. So can you tell us a little bit about like the scope of work that was performed specifically for the park and kind of the overhaul that your team was tasked in completing?
Okay. Yes, the park, when we started on the project, I would say it was tired. And it had, as was described earlier, it when more opportunities opened up for the community, it became it lost favor in some ways, but it still had the core essence of the master plan that had established the community center and the pool house there back in the 1930s. So when that had established a axial relationship that you see even today, And so when we took on the project, what we wanted to do is to honor that, to also that past, but to also stitch it in with contemporary needs for a public park. And so we went about renovating the community center, and that building had, through the years, every single window had been bricked up. There was no daylight in there. And in fact, the front doors, if I recall correctly, were just metal doors at that time. And so we began to excavate through that, opening up that and restoring that building, restoring the stage, which is a two-sided. It faces inside, but it can also open to the exterior, and to really bring that building back to life. And we also renovated and enhanced the pool house and completely rebuilt the swimming pool area. And then we also added the recreation center that you see, which is now the largest building on the site for athletics and exercise classes and things like that. But then also it supports a performing arts area that overlooks an event lawn there. And we also added picnic shelters. We restored the softball court, added tennis and basketball, outdoor basketball, and then a kids play area was added, and with a splash pad and things like that. So those were some of the programmatic developments. One thing that was really important, though, I think symbolically for the Juneteenth that was spoken about just a moment ago, is the triumphal arch that sits on that main axis and is part of that Juneteenth celebration of this once a year celebrating that passage through the gateways to freedom and to opportunity and independence.
Wow, thank you. That's, yeah, definitely wonderful. And I think it's great to understand how a lot of the historical qualities of the park, it wasn't a complete upend redo. It was, you tried to preserve as much as you could, and and allow for that past to still be very prevalent in the park's present day state and obviously into the future. So I also wanted to ask you, Kenneth, if you could tell us a little bit about some of the sustainable strategies that were employed on the project. Obviously as a firm, sustainability is one of our core values. And I think, specifically, in recent years, but really in recent months, we've started talking about the importance of sustainability in perpetuating social equity and justice. But so I would love to hear from you first about the specific sustainable strategies employed, and then perhaps we can dive into why sustainability is important in creating a more equitable and just project and society.
Okay. Well, the a lot of these, for I guess most of our participants who are architects or landscape architects, they may seem run of the mill, but we really we tried to integrate a number of passive cooling. It being Houston, cooling is the bigger challenge, but passive cooling with the large porches and ways of creating comfortable indoor-outdoor environments. The event lawn has a large thermal, has a lot of thermal wells in there for the cooling system. And then we also, during the design, probably more than any project I've ever done, we invested significantly in the preservation of the existing trees. And what it meant is that we moved some very large oak trees, and larger than anything that I'd moved on other projects. But the value of the shade of a live oak tree, the symbolism of a live oak tree to the community, both of those together are part of that sustainable design, but also part of that respect for the history of the park, that it wasn't about wiping the slate clean and we'll bring in all new. It was about respect for that history, but interweaving that with sustainable design practices. Of course, many of the other practices of, around, efficient systems and locally sourced materials and things like that. We try to incorporate as much as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And so what do you feel, how do you feel sustainability can play an important role in creating social justice? I know, we've previously spoken about, it's particularly in Houston, the climatic effects of hurricanes and Hurricane Harvey, and just wondering what your thoughts are and how sustainability can help create equity.
Well, I first have to recognize that it's important to underscore that care for our environment and care for our earth is it's not just about preservation, but it's also a human rights issue, and it's very much a civil rights issue. The health the health impacts of pollution and in our environment, and particularly in areas like Houston, where we have a lot of industry, the impact to the communities of color and low-income communities for their health, for education outcomes, and all of that have a direct connection to the environment. And then longer-term impacts of environmental degradation that you had mentioned, such as increasing storms and things of that nature, those continue to impact low-income communities the most. And so it is very much our responsibility, not just to our earth, to be kinder in how we deal with the environment, but it's a social issue that goes to civil rights and human rights.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Thank you for your response. And so I think, kind of going off that, I have a few questions for you both in terms of, social equity and social justice. But particularly I wanted to touch on, because this is something that you both mentioned in kind of your responses, was the importance of community engagement. So first, Ms. Jacqueline, I'd love to ask you kind of how you feel, or how you think, or what is the importance, I should say, of community engagement when you're working with architects and designers? Why do you think it's important? And Ms. Jacqueline, I think you're on mute. I think you're still on mute.
I think as host, you can unmute her.
Can I? Okay,
Yes.
that's a good point. I probably can do that. Let me see. Oh, it says I can mute, but I can't unmute.
Okay.
So, okay, there we go.
Now, is that it?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Great. So, yeah, if you could just tell us, why you think community engagement is important, particularly when we're doing design and working with designers and architects.
Well, I think it's important always, whether it's in architectural design or any other avenue or event or anything that's going to have to do with the community where people have to live. The people who live there should always have the ability to be able to have input into the things that they see. First of all, they know the community, they know what's there. They know the pros and cons of different things that you might want to do, but they also know that maybe there are other ways or other things you might want to consider before you make a final decision. So I think that their input is always important as it relates to any of the activities or any of the things that we do in our daily lives. And I never, ever go into a group trying to tell them what they need to do, because I don't really know what they need to do. I need for them to help me to understand what their situation is, and maybe what are some of the things they might like to see happen. How can we improve what's already there?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think, communities are the content experts of their surroundings, and so being able as designers, but really, like you said, in any profession or in any circumstance in which you would need to perform community engagement, it's important to first listen before actually telling people how they should do something. So I think, that you hit the nail on the head for sure. Kenneth, I wanted to get your thoughts as well, of why you think it's important.
Well, I think you just said it as well as could be. They're the content experts on what is necessary there. One of the highest honors I think that I've heard of Perkins&Will is I was on a panel discussion at Kennesaw a couple of years ago, and one of our clients said that well-meaning architects will they used to they might design in spite of the community, but just because they think they know best. A little bit better meaning architects will design for the community. At least they're trying to focus in on that community. But that she said that what we were doing through our remembrance design process was we were designing with the community, and designing with the community is really it really does make a big difference, because we cannot assume that we fully understand what is needed and the best step forward, but that our role is to work with that community through our remembrance design process, to go with them and understand the journey of that community to where they are today. We don't just meet them where they are today. We want to go on a journey from where they've been to where they are today, and then with them begin to imagine what are the opportunities for that community going forward, and how can we design something together to go forward. And that really builds a more sustainable, socially sustainable design over time.
Absolutely. So I think, one thing, as a young designer, and I have some background in community development, I've always still trying to find the best ways to engage community in design and in projects. So would love to hear from both of you what you think some good strategies are to engage with community. Obviously, charrettes and meeting in person or virtually, I guess, right now in the era of COVID. It's there are plenty of tools available, but I think every project kind of warrants different tools. But would love to hear, from both of you in your long-standing careers, what have been some successful engagement strategies you've come into contact with?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm just going to say that Perkins&Will they were very, very easy to work with, in that they actually believed in listening to the community. As was stated earlier, there were more trees preserved than are normally preserved on a project. But those trees were preserved because that's what the community wanted. And those of us who were the volunteers and working with the community, as well as with the architects and the other groups that were involved in making, helping to redesign the facilities and things in the park, listened to what the community wanted. And even though they wanted the beautiful new facilities, they did not want to lose the wonderful trees and the shade and the ability, those things that were there and had been there all the time. So it's you have to figure out how you're going to work with the group, but you must understand there is always a need to work with the group that you are doing the designing for. And I thought your company really did an excellent job of doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. And then, so Kenneth, I don't know, I know you've worked on many other projects. I think we previously spoke about your work on Destination Crenshaw as well, but, would love to hear your thoughts with your expertise. What have been some successful strategies you've employed for community engagement in your projects?
Well, Ms. Bostic mentioned the first and the most key is to listen with in a honoring way, so that you really try to understand But then as the design begins to take shape, what some of the strategies that we draw out from our remembrance design process are that as we ask our participants or the participating community to bring tangible memories of their journey and to share with us what those stories are and why those stories are relevant to their personal self, but also to the community. And from those stories, we are able to glean a great deal of understanding. And these stories don't necessarily they aren't directly about the project. We don't start with tell us what you want. We want them to share with us their experience and to bring these witnesses forward. And those do become the framework around which we can build a strong story. We also, that idea of designing with the community, we transition from listening and remembering to working with them on, we call it blue sky thinking. And we just sort of put it all out there. And some of the ideas are completely impractical. And it doesn't matter, because behind those ideas, whether they're practical or impractical, are those are the seeds of some good idea that will come over time if we give it time and if we nurture that. And we bring forward from that a series of prevailing design, what we might call prevailing themes that we are starting to hear more over and over from the community. Those themes then become we shape those into a unifying narrative or a story that becomes the foundation, the conceptual foundation for the project. And having that unifying narrative is really important because it helps tie together the architecture and the landscape architecture. If they're public art, it helps tie that together. Monuments, for example, at Emancipation Park, the four corner monuments being part of that narrative of storytelling. And so it all leads up to a beautiful concept over time, but it does require, we start with listening and honoring and really taking the time to understand.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, and being able, in being able to do those things, it's, you could have people that come to a project that may not necessarily know a lot about it, but I feel like they can feel the significance, throughout the architecture of the place and why it might be important.
Mm-hmm.
And, I certainly felt that when I visited Emancipation Park for the first time at the opening, not knowing too much about Houston myself at the time and the significance of the park, it just, everything had such a great synergy to it that I felt like, man, this place is really something special, and I really need to learn more about it. And, and I think certainly that'll prevail throughout the years of the park and being, an important landmark here in Houston. So I did want to ask Ms. Jacqueline about, and this was a question that I didn't get to ask you earlier. But obviously you've been in Houston for a very long time and have done so many wonderful things for this community and the city. But obviously in remembrance of Martin Luther King Jr. and all that he's done for creating a more just and equitable society, I'd love to hear a little bit about your experiences with the civil rights movement in Houston, and would also love to hear your thoughts on some of the or I should say on the George Floyd protests that happened this year, and just what are your thoughts on kind of these conversations still happening?
Well, I'm going to say probably that at this day and time that in many ways I'm really sort of disappointed in the fact that after many years, since I happen to have been a young adult at the time of the civil rights movement, and there were so many people who gave so much of their time, their talent, their lives, their blood, their sweat, their tears to tried to help make sure that our nation was one of opportunity and equality for all. And to now, at this point in my life, to see that the things that we thought uh, were becoming changeable, and so that more people were being able to be real participants in our communities, in our government, in our world, and to see that somehow we haven't gotten really past that. And I guess it troubles me because from my personal understanding and participation, is that you have to be willing to give of yourself. You have to be willing to understand the humanity of everyone. Uh, and if you happen to be one that believes that there's a God of whatever your religious or non-religious stance may be, to be one, if you want believe in a good environment and all the other things, and understand that, knowing we did not create this earth ourselves, all of this beautiful blue sky and the clouds and all the wonderful things that we have inherited and been given through the graciousness and the grace and the mercy of someone else, and that we can't even understand that a part of this life is the interdependency of all things upon each other. And being, if you're in any type of a field where you have to deal with science and all of those things, you know that there's an independency. So if there's an independency, why would you continue to do things to deny that independency and the humanity of others that may not look like you or speak the same language that you do, but do things that would be harmful to bring about the chaos and discard of what should be the willingness to be sustainable and to go forth and provide opportunities so that all of you can live and live a fruitful and productive life.
No, I think your point about interdependency, like I said, I'm still a young designer coming up through the ranks, and, Kenneth, I'm surely your experiences throughout this profession over the years can probably speak to this even more. But, it's something that, I think all of us try to strive to do, is understanding the importance of the humanity that we serve in our profession as designers. And that's why I think, when we're speaking about community engagement and listening, we don't all share the same life experiences of the people that we serve. And I think being able to listen with great intent and also, just with empathy is what allows us to create impact in our projects that's meaningful. And I know certainly for me that, that can look different in any project that you do. But I think it's important to find the niche of your ability to accomplish that, regardless of the project work that you're performing. Kenneth, I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I heard you say totally.
No, I very much agree. And Ms. Bostic, I think the wisdom that you just shared with us is something that I'm glad that we're recording this, right? So I think your wisdom and perspective is really important, and the interdependence of all things. We cannot underestimate. We cannot over emphasize, because it really is true that everything is connected, and we as designers, I think that what we need to do is well, one thing that I advise is that we recognize that each time we design something, whether it's a landscape or a product or a building or an interior, that we are designing in a way that is that design expresses the values of our client, but also ourselves as designers. And sometimes in very overt ways and sometimes in more subtle ways. But nevertheless, everything that we design is an expression of the values that we have around what is beautiful or what is not, what is appropriate, who is included and who is excluded, what is the right use of a program. All of these things come together in our design work, and it's very important for us to keep that in mind so that when we're designing, we are willing to at least challenge or scrutinize the status quo. Because if we always only perpetuate the status quo, we will not bring about the change necessary for us to move to that more diverse, equitable, and inclusive world that I believe everyone on this call would aspire to.
Absolutely. And I think, and one thing to always to remember, and you said this, is that, for every action, there's a reaction. And I think in understanding that, if you're not careful and about what your design or what your projects put forth, and not fully understanding kind of what the impacts of it could be, whether positive or negative, then you could potentially be in a position where you make those mistakes again. So I think, in being able to have these conversations, like obviously, Emancipation Park, it was completed a few years ago, but in being able to continue to engage with you all, Ms. Bostic, and those at Emancipation Park Conservancy, and, the greater community in the 3rd and 4th wards here in Houston, we can have a better understanding of what those impacts actually are with the design that was put forth, because I feel like, you can have all the best intent, but it takes years sometimes to actually see how those intents manifest into impact. So, very, very grateful to you both and being able to have this conversation. We do have about 8 minutes left. So I wanted to go ahead and open up the forum, and feel free to either comment a question in the chat for our panelists, or turn on your microphones. And yeah, would just love to invite those from the audience that haven't been able to participate to ask a question.
I think Jason Bernal.
Yes, Kristen and Kenneth, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I have a question regarding design inclusivity. Both you, Kenneth, and Ms. Jacqueline mentioned considering the humanity of everyone in the community. And I wanted to get your insight on how, as designers, we can approach the opportunity of designing for the homeless population.
Okay. I will start, and I'll admit that that is not an area that I have some expertise in. I would say that within Perkins&Will, our Los Angeles office has really engaged this in a significant way, and could probably add a lot more to this. But the one thing that I think we should probably keep in mind is that whether it's homelessness or other social issues, other challenges that we have, one project can never solve it all. And there's no such thing, I believe, as a one-shot answer, like we'll build this one thing and it'll solve everything. It's part of an entire ecosystem of that involves policy, codes and laws and commerce and social equity. It's all interwoven in there, and the homeless population in the richest country in the world is shameful how many are homeless in our amongst us in our communities. And I believe that architects can play one role in solving this, but it's part of a larger, it's just one part of a larger solution that we'll have to pursue. But I would, you know, I think that maybe we need more architects to be involved in local government, for example, helping craft policies that do have direct impact on the homeless.
I'd like to add to that, and I agree with you that it is truly a community effort that is needed. Uh, in Houston, there have been projects that have worked on the trying to provide housing for the homeless population. But as Kenneth said, one or two projects will not resolve that issue. There are so many other factors, but it's not something that can't be done. Again, it takes the community effort and political will to do something about it. And so that's inclusive of everybody.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Jason, for your question. Is there anyone else that has questions or would like, or any even comments or thoughts on the conversation we've been having today? So I guess in waiting for someone else to respond, Ms. Bostic, I did want to ask you, what are some of your favorite aspects of the park?
What are some of my favorite aspects of the
Yeah,
park?
like what are some of your
Okay.
favorite design aspects of the park?
I really like the way that I love the newest building to the park. The design is beautiful. The colors are striking and really make a progressive statement, forward movement. I like the way that you redesign the culture, what we call the cultural center now. How you took out all of the boards, how you reopened it to the public and community. I think that's wonderful also. And the the stage facing one way and the stage facing the other. And I also love the expansiveness of the pool area and how you redid that. Uh, I mean, you did such a wonderful job. I mean, you can't imagine. Well, you can, because those of you who worked on the park,
Yeah.
you know exactly how it looked at the time that you did the redesign and how it looks now, and it's just made a total difference, even in the area around the park, and so that's commendable and that's exciting.
Awesome.
One thing I'll add is that I think it's commendable that Emancipation Park, I think the oldest park in Texas, a public park, and that it has remained a public park for so long. And right now we're working with the Austin office on a museum project there. And what we've discovered, actually I see Stephen Colston here, that Austin also had an Emancipation Park at one time. Unfortunately, they lost that park because of it was restrictive. Well, it was politics involved, discriminatory politics. But the fact that Houston has held on to Emancipation Park, nurtured this park, and that it in turn has nurtured the community for so long, and we hope for many decades to come, I think is quite commendable.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So I see one question in the chat from Stephen, actually, that we'll go ahead and make our last question, because I actually find this to be a really important topic as well. It says, Kenneth, you mentioned unique social and environmental impacts. Can you speak to community engagement during the age of COVID?
Well, in the 1 minute that we have left,
Yeah.
One thing that we've done there in Austin for the George Washington Carver Museum with the Austin office that Stephen is leading the project on is we are using whiteboard, and we started it before we had Miro, but now I think we would use Miro. But we've been able to engage the community in a series of forums where they can, we've broken it into manageable groups so that they can have a voice in that group, and we record that. And so we've done dozens of community engagements there in Austin around for the George Washington Carver. And I think it's worked not as well as in person, because you can't give a hug and get to know people in that more intimate way, but it is a way that it seems to be working. And one thing that's really important is that these community groups and engagements, these are not once or twice engagements. We come on all of our projects, we meet with this community repeatedly for sometimes years. And so you do build strong relationships over time, and those are very important to the success of the project.
Awesome.
True.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. I just wanted to say thank you, Ms. Bostic and Kenneth, and for the social purpose and Jedi leads out of Houston, Dallas, Austin, and North Carolina for helping us put this together. I did want to highlight, and you'll get some additional information from your social purpose leads, that we do have a volunteer project ongoing with Emancipation Park Conservancy. And this project is a way for us to help pilot and test their virtual our educational platform for the park. So we'll get more information to you guys through your social purpose leads. It was included in the original calendar invite and email. It's just you sign up and it's a 35-minute park tour essentially, but it's all virtual, and we'll be providing them important feedback to help continue to develop their virtual platform for the park. So in the era of COVID, we are still piloting how to best engage and to do good work through our Service Plus program. So would really love for you all to participate with this program. But anyway, I think that's all the time we have. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bostic, and thank you,
Thank
Kenneth,
you for
again.
inviting me.
Thank you.
Of course. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So this is just